Well, welcome to the Debt Matters podcast, where we help Canadians find solutions to their debt with licensed insolvency trustees from across Canada. I'm Wayne Kay, and in today's show, we're going to be learning all about the effects of Canadians' CERB repayments and taxes and COVID-19. My guest today is Daniel Maksymchak with LC Taylor Licensed Insolvency Trustee in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Daniel, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Wayne.
Terrific. Well, this is a great topic. CERB payments, for anybody that doesn't know. I mean, this is maybe 2 years ago, I'd never heard of a CERB payment, but nowadays, this was very popular in helping many Canadians get through the pandemic. Explain CERB payments.
Sure. So CERB payments, nobody had heard of 2 years ago because they didn't exist, right? They were brought upon by the pandemic, a creation of the federal government to help people through the lockdowns and the shutdowns that were precipitated by the pandemic, to provide essentially income replacement for those people who had lost their income due to their place of employment shutting down or being forced to shut down.
Mm-hmm. And it definitely helped a lot of Canadians. And we're going to talk about what that means to people's taxes, et cetera. Now, a lot of people, when it started, they never even thought of tax implications. Was this something they needed to think about, or was it just a matter of survival?
Yeah, I think that was just it, at the matter of survival, in the sense of that's how the government set it up, just to get it out as quickly as possible so that it was there to ensure the survival of Canadians. And the tax implications of it were probably the furthest things from the mind of the recipients and the federal government. It doesn't seem like paid that much attention to it at the beginning, because as it went through, there were some miscommunications and kind of contradictions on the part of the federal government that led them to eventually have to change and walk back some of the policies. But it was done with the intention of course, getting money out as quickly as possible to those who needed it, and making sure that the damaging impacts of the pandemic economically were minimized.
Mm-hmm. Do you think they did a good job of it?
I think given the circumstances and that it had to be rushed out in very short order, I think it served the purpose of keeping a lot of people out of impoverished situations because of the pandemic. I mean, statistically, and this was very counterintuitive to people in our industry, is that bankruptcy and insolvency filings actually went down at the start of the pandemic and through most of it, because at least partly because of the CERB money that people were receiving was able to keep them afloat, and in some cases was actually providing more money than they had been receiving prior to the pandemic starting.
Yeah, I think it was really a quick lifesaver for so many people. If they didn't have that, who knows what would have happened to our country. So let's talk about what the kind of the impact has been regarding income taxes at the end of the year regarding CERB payments.
Yeah, so of course, this wasn't on people's mind back in March of 2020, April of 2020, when they started applying for the CERB, and it wasn't until a year later, so when they had to file their taxes for 2020, that this kind of became a top of mind issue, was that, hey, this is taxable income and it's going to get added to the rest of the income that you earned in 2020. And there was no tax withheld on CERB, at least in its first iteration. So that money, when it's added to your income, depending on what tax rate you were in based on the rest of the income you made in the year, could have a substantial tax impact that you're going to owe at the end of the year when you filed your taxes, which of course came due April, May of this year of 2021.
So were people caught off guard by that, you think?
There were definitely some people who, typically year in, year out had received refunds for whatever reason, had more tax taken off of their checks throughout the year than ought to have been. They get a refund at the end of the year. But in this case of 2020, when CERB was received and added into the calculation, having no tax withheld at source, suddenly people who expected to receive refunds and sometimes counted on that to maybe catch up on some payments that, they do every year that way, or maybe they rely on that to do something that they do once a year that they do when they receive that money. Suddenly they went from a position where they were expecting a chunk of money to actually owing them an amount of money, which can be a significant change and can come out of the blue for some of these people who had never been in that situation before.
Yeah. And if you don't have that savings, what do? All of a sudden you get this big tax bill at the end of the year, because a lot of Canadians did very well at the beginning, make a fair amount of money, and then all of a sudden you add on these payments and you get that big tax bill. So how does the CERB How has it affected maybe other government credits and benefits that people receive?
So much the same as it was done in included in income on your income taxes. It's also included in your income for the purposes of any means tested benefit that the government issues or people normally receive, such as a common one is the guaranteed income supplement. So that's intended to supplement the income of seniors who have a lower income and provide them with enough funds to live a reasonable standard of living. And when the calculation includes the CERB in the income to determine how much you should receive in the GIS, then it reduces how much you receive in the GIS, because based on prior year's income, you're not requiring as much of this supplement in order to maintain a reasonable standard of living. So that led to, in 2021, people having their GIS payments reduced based on income that they received in 2020. And of course, the government, this has been brought to their attention, and ministers have been interviewed about it. And they argue, of course, that, well, yes, your GIS is reduced, but it's only been reduced by $1 for every $2 that were received in the CERB in this instance. And it's still a net benefit to the people, which may be true mathematically, but if the people weren't expecting the GIS to be reduced and the money's gone, there's no getting it back now. And now they're having to make do on a reduced monthly payment that they hadn't expected.
Yeah, that's a really big one, because what is that GIS? Sometimes it can be upwards of $900, can it not?
Yeah, that could be around the maximum of it, right? It's intended to boost up the income of seniors, right, who for whatever reason throughout their life might not have as high a CPP payment as some others. And this is kind of intended to, keep those people out of poverty, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And so how did this work? Because if you were already on an income, let's say you're retired, how did you end up getting CERB payments? Or were they just kind of one-time payments that happened for seniors? I know there were a couple of those. Any idea?
Yeah. So some seniors, to supplement their income, they work part-time jobs or some kind of source of income too.
Oh.
So if that income was reduced because of the pandemic, say they were working part-time in a restaurant, baking or serving, and that restaurant closed, then they would reduce their income by the amount that resulted in them qualifying for CERB. So they applied for CERB legitimately, received the money legitimately. But now that's being impacted into their guaranteed income supplement calculation, and there's less money being received now this year.
So when does that get corrected? Will that be for next year's taxes?
Yeah, usually there's a bit of a lag. So the 2021 payment is based on your 2020 taxes and so on. So the normal process would be for this to be corrected in your 2022 payments would be based on your 2021 taxes. So depending on these people's income situation for 2021, it should be adjusted to rectify that situation. But there is a possibility where if the senior believes that their income is going to be lower this year significantly than it was in 2020, they could apply for a review. And in limited cases, the government can approve you to receive the GIS based on what your expected income for 2021 would be. But that requires time. Someone has to, I think it's more of a manual review process than just a simple calculation based on your income. Yeah. So it's not an immediate solution, I don't believe.
Right. Well, now that the CERB has ended, what government support is available to those people whose jobs were impacted by COVID-19 and now they still don't have work?
Yeah, so in the past tense, if their jobs were impacted in the past, really there's nothing available to them for the past impact of COVID-19, even if it's still impacting their current situation. The government has replaced CERB or CRB, which replaced CERB, and now it's the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit, which is meant to specifically target situations where someone's job has been impacted by a current lockdown that's been put in place due to public health measures. And it pays $300 per week, which was the same as the CRB was paying through most of the summer once it was reduced around July, I believe. But the problem is that it's a lot harder to qualify now. You have to have been impacted by a specific current lockdown, not by the impacts of COVID-19 in the past. So it's a lot more restrictive who can qualify. And as well, it's only eligible for people who aren't eligible for EI. So you're meant to exhaust your EI benefits prior to qualifying for that, which, for most people wouldn't be a problem. The EI would probably pay out more anyways. But if you don't have EI because you've already exhausted it because you lost your job in the past because of COVID-19 and you still haven't been able to find anything else, you would not qualify for this Canada Worker Lockdown benefit because you're not, your income hasn't been reduced by this current present lockdown.
Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden we go through, we've maybe lost jobs. We had a few, some of these benefits coming our way. Now we're seeing the economy opening up again, and there seems to be a shortage of workers everywhere. Is that playing into, people applying for benefits? Are they now starting to say, well, we're not going to give you a benefit because there's all these different jobs out there? Any ideas on that?
Yeah, I believe that definitely played into the thoughts of the government when they brought in this more restrictive benefit. There were certainly some complaints from business owners and certain industry organizations that people were relying too much on CERB and CRB, and it was a disincentive to work, and therefore it was harder to fill these positions. Whether there's any merit to that, I don't know, but I'm sure it played into the impact, into the thought process of the government when designing this new program. And it's difficult because there are jobs out there, as you've noted, people are crying out for jobs, for people to fill these jobs, but there's not always a match between the people who lost their jobs in the past and these current jobs that are being looking to be filled now, right? So that's sometimes a disconnect, and there are definitely going to be some people who fall into this gap where they lost their job in the past due to CERB. Maybe that job doesn't even exist anymore due to some of the changes in the economy that's happened since then, and they're not a fit for some of these new jobs that are hiring, and yet they don't qualify for this Canada Worker Lockdown benefit because it's that their employment situation is due to the circumstances of the past, not a current lockdown.
And now all of a sudden, let's say you get hit with some big income tax bill or a big debt. What are you supposed to do then?
Well, I mean, that's the problem, right? Not only are you having your income reduced presently due to this change in CERB or CRB, but you also may have a debt from the past to pay off, whether it's due to debt that you incurred while you were trying to get by during the initial parts of the pandemic, or perhaps a tax bill due to these things that we talked about earlier, that being considered to be taxable income. And it may be debt such that even if you were able to find a job, even making the same income you were making prior to the pandemic, it may just be too high at this point with the interest rates on that sort of debt to be able to pay off. So then you might be looking at having to restructure your debt. And that's something you should definitely talk to a licensed insolvency trustee about in order to find out what your options are and see, is there a way out of this debt that I've accrued as a result of the pandemic, even if things have turned around for you since those early days of it.
I want to talk about that for just a moment, because if somebody's listening and they just heard you say, well, it's kind of like, is that like consolidating all your debt, or how do you look at this? What are the ways that you go about doing that?
Yeah, so there's a few different options, right? So when you sit down for a free consultation with the licensed insolvency trustee, you're going to be given all of your options essentially. And that could be something as simple as, look at your budget. Have you considered making these changes to your budget to free up more of your monthly cash flow to pay down your debt and therefore get out of debt sooner? Or maybe it's something like, well, your interest rates on these credit cards are so high that you're not really tackling the principal. And maybe you should look at a consolidation loan where you go into your bank or another financial institution and say, I need a loan for X dollars, use that loan to pay out your other debts at a higher interest rate. And now you just have one payment at a lower interest rate, and it's easier to keep track of. You're paying less in interest. And sometimes that's enough to get people out of debt. But it may be such that due to the pandemic and the job loss and whatever the certain circumstances are at that time, that maybe there's been unfortunate damage to someone's credit rating, or their income level is not there anymore to support a consolidation loan. And then you're talking about something like a consumer proposal to your creditors to settle that debt for less than you owe, or even a bankruptcy, right? Something that your payment is dependent on actually what you can afford versus what you actually owe in the first place and what the bank wants you to pay.
See, and this is where it can be so frustrating for so many people because, as you said, all of a sudden your credit rating drops and then they don't want to give you a loan because your credit rating dropped. But what we went through in the last 18 months, 19, 20 months, whatever it is, this has been unprecedented. We've never seen such a thing before. And it's got to be so frustrating for anybody who's now in this situation where they were doing great. But you know how Canadians, we like to live on the edge. We like to, consumer debt is high for a lot of people. Certainly. And all of a sudden, we're usually, I think, like a paycheck or two away from having a financial problem. But yet so many Canadians live that way. All of a sudden, you have this situation come, and now the banks will say, well, yeah, things have changed. I'm sorry, we can't give you a loan. That has got to be just so heartbreaking for that person who's been working, you know, their whole lives, and never had a problem.
Yeah, and it certainly is. And we see that all the time with people who come in and consult with us. They say, well, I've been with this bank for 15 or 20 years and I've been a good customer, always making my loan payments or paying my interest prior to COVID. And then this came and, you know, what could I do? I had no choice. And now suddenly the bank doesn't want to have anything to do with me. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it is certainly frustrating for those people. And sometimes they have to turn to alternative lenders that charge often a much higher interest rate than a traditional bank would. And sometimes that just digs things deeper, right? So it's definitely frustrating for those people. And a one-off situation like this can just derail your finances, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's not just one person. So if somebody's listening and they're in that exact situation, you're not alone. Lots of people have gone through this as you talk to people every day.
Yeah, for sure. Right. I mean, now that some of these benefits have ended, the real effects of the pandemic financially are starting to come through in terms of what we see coming into our doors, looking for consultations and help and advice with regards to their debt. And yeah, nobody listening would certainly be on their own. I mean, it's going to, I believe, create a swell of people who are in this situation now that the government supports are starting to taper off.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important that they know there is help. And in that help is the licensed insolvency trustees from across the country. And Daniel, of course, if they have questions or they want to do, you know, a free consultation with you, they can just contact your office.
They certainly can. Yes, at LC Taylor here in Winnipeg. We're centrally located. We're local. We're in Winnipeg. All of our staff and files are administered in Winnipeg, and we'd certainly be happy to talk to any of our listeners in the province who are looking for help with their debt.
Terrific. Well, Daniel, great information. Thank you very much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Wayne.
You got it. Daniel Maksymchak from LC Taylor, licensed insolvency trustee. And as he mentioned, the website, lctaylor.com. And that's it for today's Debt Matters podcast. Make sure you subscribe wherever you do get your favorite podcasts from. And of course, for more information, you can always check out our website, debtmatters.ca. Thanks for listening.